All right, so buckle up because today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. Nuclear detonation preparedness.
Yeah, not exactly light dinner conversation.
No, not at all. But it's something we need to talk about. And we've got a fascinating document to guide us through it. FEMA's Planning Guidance for a Response to a Nuclear Detonation.
This thing's like a Bible for disaster preparedness.
Seriously, it's incredibly detailed and surprisingly engaging.
Yeah, you know what? I thought it was going to be all like technical jargon and dry statistics.
Right, like something you'd need a PhD to decipher.
Exactly. But it's actually written in a way that's easy to understand. You even got a fictional narrative playing out the first few hours after a hypothetical attack on a city they call Metropolis.
Yeah, that Metropolis story is a real eye-opener.
It really brings the whole thing to life.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of like what to do during and after a detonation, let's talk about why this document even exists.
Well, I think it's pretty clear. The threat of nuclear conflict is unfortunately very real in today's world.
Right, and knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we understand about the potential risks and challenges, the better prepared we'll be to face them.
Okay, so let's jump into that Metropolis story I mentioned. There's this family a few miles outside the city when the detonation happens. They think they're safe.
Right, because they're not in the immediate blast zone.
Exactly. But then the wind shifts.
No, right.
And suddenly, they're right in the path of the fallout.
Yeah, that's one of the key takeaways from the document. Fallout patterns can be unpredictable.
You can't just assume you're safe because you're a certain distance away.
Nope, the wind can change everything.
That's unsettling. But before we get too deep into fallout, let's back up and talk about the detonation itself.
Okay, the big boom.
Right. The document emphasizes that not all nukes are created equal. What does that even mean?
Well, it comes down to a few things. The yield of the weapon, the height of the burst, even the type of material used.
Okay, so yield, that's basically how powerful the explosion is, right?
Right, it's measured in kilotons of TNT equivalent, basically how much energy is released.
To give you some perspective, the Beirut port explosion a few years back was roughly equivalent to a 1 kiloton device.
Wow, and that was devastating.
Exactly. And then there's the thermal pulse, that blinding flash of heat.
Yeah, that can cause severe burns and start fires far beyond the blast radius.
It's not just the heat from the explosion itself, right? It's like this massive wave of heat energy.
Exactly. And it travels at the speed of light.
So there's no outrunning it?
Nope, you'd be instantly incinerated.
Okay, then there's the initial radiation, which I know is deadly close to the blast.
Right, but that initial radiation does fall off quickly with distance.
So the farther you are, the better.
Generally, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have to consider fallout, which can spread much farther.
Right, we talked about that a little bit earlier. What makes fallout so dangerous?
It's basically radioactive dust and debris that gets sucked up into the mushroom cloud and then rains down over a wide area.
And that stuff can stay radioactive for a long time, right?
Yeah, days, weeks, even years, depending on the isotopes involved.
So even if you survive the initial blast, you could still be exposed to dangerous levels of radiation from fallout.
Exactly. And that's why the get inside, stay tuned message is so important.
So find shelter and wait for instructions from authorities.
Right, because you don't know when or where the fallout will arrive.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly powerful blast, intense heat radiation, and then the fallout, which, as we've discussed, can be unpredictable and long-lasting.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But understanding the basics is crucial for knowing how to prepare and respond.
And that's what this document is all about. Giving us the knowledge we need to make informed decisions in a crisis.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about the different types of detonations, the immediate effects, and the dangers of fallout.
But there's still so much more to unpack.
Right. We haven't even gotten into things like triage, decontamination, long-term health effects.
Or the psychological impact of a nuclear detonation.
Yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity.
But we'll dive into all that in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned because it's going to get even more intense.
Buckle up. You know, one thing that really stuck with me from that Metropolis narrative is how the family's initial reaction was just to kind of watch the mushroom cloud form.
Yeah, like it was some kind of morbidly fascinating spectacle.
Right, and the document actually goes into the science behind that mushroom cloud formation and how it's not just a random explosion.
It's like there's a whole physics lesson in there.
Seriously. It talks about how that incredibly hot fireball rises rapidly, and as it cools, it draws in debris and condenses, creating that distinctive mushroom shape.
And the color of the cloud can actually tell you a lot about the detonation, right?
Yeah, darker cloud usually means a ground burst, which, as we talked about, tends to produce more local fallout. Lighter, more white cloud suggests an airburst.
So even the shape and color of the cloud give you valuable information. Huh. It's like nature's own warning system.
It is. And speaking of warnings, let's get back to those blast zones. We kind of touched on them before, but I'm curious how those zones are actually determined.
Yeah, like how do they know how far the damage will extend? It's not like they can just go out and measure it after a real detonation.
Right. Well, it's based on a bunch of complex calculations that take into account the yield of the weapon, the height of the burst, and even things like the terrain and weather
So
conditions.
it's not an exact science.
No, but it gives us a pretty good idea of what to expect. The zones basically represent areas where you'd experience different levels of damage from the blast wave.
And the document uses some pretty intense language to describe that damage.
It does. And it's not just about buildings collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the sheer force of the shock wave.
Yeah, in that severe damage zone, the pressure from the blast would be so intense it could crush internal organs.
Even if you were sheltered.
So being inside wouldn't guarantee your safety.
Nope, not in the severe damage zone.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there's the risk of fires.
Right, the thermal pulse would ignite anything flammable,
And downed power lines, ruptured gas lines, it would be total chaos.
like a nightmare scenario from a disaster movie.
Exactly. And that's why the document stresses the importance of evacuating the moderate damage zone as soon as it's safe to do so.
Because even if you survive the initial blast, there's still the risk of fire and radiation exposure.
Right, staying there would be incredibly dangerous.
And that brings us back to radiation. You mentioned earlier that radiation levels change over time. How can people even know if it's safe to go outside after a detonation?
Well, that's where radiation monitoring equipment comes in. Responders would be using these specialized devices to measure radiation levels and determine which areas are safe.
So there's actual science involved. It's not just about guessing or relying on gut feeling.
Exactly. And the document highlights this principle called LRA.
LRA.
Yeah, it stands for as low as reasonably achievable.
Okay, so basically minimizing your exposure as much as possible.
Right, every little bit of effort counts. It's all about making smart choices to protect yourself and others.
And that includes knowing the difference between those radiation zones. We talked about the dangerous radiation zone and the hot zone.
Right, the DRZ is immediately life-threatening, while the HZ requires more careful monitoring and limiting your time spent there.
This is a lot of information to take in, but it's starting to make sense. You've got these different zones, each with its own level of risk, and then you have to factor in the fallout, which can spread unpredictably.
It's complex for sure,
Yeah.
but the more you understand about these factors, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions in a crisis.
And speaking of being equipped, I'm curious about the practical side of things. The document talks about things like decontamination and establishing a registry of those exposed. How would that even work in a real-world scenario? Like, how do you even begin to decontaminate an entire city?
Well, it would be a massive undertaking involving specialized equipment and trained personnel.
Yeah.
You'd have teams working to decontaminate people, vehicles, buildings, basically anything that came into contact with fallout.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It would be. And then there's the registry. Imagine trying to track down everyone who is potentially exposed to radiation, collect their information, and monitor their health over time.
That sounds incredibly difficult, especially in the midst of all the other chaos.
It would be a monumental task, but it's essential for understanding the long-term health consequences and providing appropriate medical care.
So even though it's a daunting prospect, the document emphasizes that planning for these long-term challenges is just as important as preparing for the immediate aftermath of a detonation.
Absolutely. And one aspect of long-term recovery that often gets overlooked is the psychological impact.
Oh, right. We've talked about the physical dangers, but what about the mental and emotional toll of experiencing such a traumatic event?
Exactly. The fear, the grief, the uncertainty about the future would be overwhelming. The document acknowledges that the psychological effects of a nuclear detonation could be profound and long-lasting.
So it's not just about patching people up physically.
No, it's about providing mental health support as well,
Yeah.
both for survivors and for first responders who'd be dealing with incredibly difficult situations.
This is where that human element really comes into play, isn't it? It's not just about science and logistics. It's about taking care of each other and supporting each other through a truly horrific experience.
Exactly. And I think the document does a good job of recognizing that this isn't just a physical threat, but a deeply emotional and psychological one as well.
It's wild to think that we've only scratched the surface of this whole nuclear detonation thing.
Oh, yeah, we've covered a lot, but there's so much more to consider, especially when it comes to the long-term impacts.
Like we talked about that registry of those exposed. What kind of information would they even be tracking for each person?
Well, it'd be like trying to piece together this giant puzzle,
Yeah.
except the pieces are people's lives. They'd need to know the estimated radiation dose each person received, where they were during the event, any immediate symptoms they experienced. It's a lot.
It's mind-boggling, and it makes you think like we'd need this whole new branch of medicine dedicated to radiation exposure.
Absolutely. Understanding and treating the unique health effects would be a huge challenge.
What about the environment? How do you even start to clean up something like this?
Decontamination on that scale, it'd be a multifaceted beast, for sure. Teams working on people, vehicles, buildings, anything that came into contact with fallout.
It's overwhelming just thinking about it, and then what? What do you do with all that contaminated soil and water?
Right, that's a big question. Where do you put it? How do you dispose of it safely? And what about the long-term effects on wildlife and ecosystems? We're still dealing with the consequences of Chernobyl and Fukushima decades later.
This document really highlights the need for long-term environmental monitoring, right?
Oh, absolutely. Tracking how radiation spreads and decays over time, understanding the ripple effects on the whole ecosystem, it's a long game.
We're talking about a recovery process that could span generations, and we can't forget about the psychological trauma we discussed earlier. How do you address the mental and emotional needs of survivors after something like this?
Well, the document emphasizes the importance of a comprehensive mental health response. Therapists, counselors, social workers, anyone trained to help people cope with trauma,
Wow.
grief, anxiety, all of it,
It'd require huge investment in mental health resources.
for sure. And a willingness to address those invisible wounds that might not show up on a medical scan.
It's a powerful reminder that this is ultimately a human tragedy. Loss of life, loss of homes, loss of security, and the first responders dealing with unimaginable devastation, risking their own lives to help others.
You know what really struck me, though, is that this document doesn't just focus on the negative. It also acknowledges the resilience of the human spirit.
That's a good point. Our ability to come together, support each other in times of crisis.
Exactly. It recognizes the power of community shared purpose, finding hope even in the darkest of times.
It's not sugarcoating the reality, but recognizing that we have the power to act, to learn to adapt.
And that's a powerful message, especially in a world where these threats feel increasingly real. This document isn't just a guide to surviving a nuclear detonation, it's a testament to human ingenuity.
Our ability to plan for and hopefully prevent the worst.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a heavy deep dive, no doubt, but I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of just how complex this issue really is.
Me too. It's not just about ducking and covering, it's about long-term thinking, community resilience, recognizing the human cost.
And for everyone listening, we've included links to the full FEMA document and other resources in the show notes.
If you're interested in learning more, definitely check those out.
Knowledge is power, right?
Right.
Especially when it comes to something as consequential as this.
Couldn't agree more. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.